Fantastic. Sure, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. 9 a.m. on the Tuesday of conference is not a small feat. I'm so really amazed to have you here, especially given it's a potentially rather dry discussion about tax. So we'll do what we can to spice it up. Just a few words before I introduce the speakers in terms of context. So we're, of course, going to look forward into what are sort of the fiscal and tax pressures that the government's facing, but also just to acknowledge that a lot of things that we've, IPPR, have pushed have actually been put into practice by this government. They have increased spending by 2% of GDP in the last budget, half of that tax-funded, the other half funded by borrowing. These things we called for a large increase in public sector wages, which addressed big retention pressures in the public sector, something we had called for and put a paper out. They changed the fiscal rules in order to do more investment, about 100 billion over this parliament, also something we called for. So in terms of funding better public services, we're very pleased that a lot of things are happening. And sometimes when you're just forward-looking, you're not always acknowledging the good things that have already happened. But that said, obviously, in the news, and Rachel Reeves sort of alluded to this in her speech yesterday, there are pressures coming up with regards to the autumn budget. It probably won't be a good idea to address these through more borrowing. And so the question of how to fund public services naturally goes to the question of, can we do more on tax? And obviously the number one mission of this government is to boost growth. And so the questions that we like to touch on include, what if we need to do something on tax, what are some long-term reforms that would actually make the system better rather than just merely raising revenue? So tax reforms that would be good for growth and make the system more fair and efficient. Also specifically, looking at specific taxes, how can these be designed to be actually good for entrepreneurship and encourage investment in the UK? And then finally, which of these options should be looked at with regards to the autumn budget? Because not all of them can necessarily be put in place straight away in the autumn. They're longer-term reforms. Okay, so to discuss these kinds of questions with me is a really, really great panel. So we have Dan Tomlinson, who is the first Labour member of Parliament for Chipping Barnet. He's focused on reducing crime, increasing community safety, but also was a founding member of the Labour Growth Group. So very much well-placed to think about the growth implications of what we're talking about. But then, of course, now he is the Exchequer Secretary to HM Treasury. Then we have Yuan Yang MP. She is member for Parliament for Reading, serving on the Treasury Select Committee. She's a former economist and award-winning journalist. She spent her career looking at sort of the questions of economic policy and power and advocating for an economy that's more fair and works for people and the planet. So hi Yuan. Then we have Andy Summers. He's the director for the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation, who are sponsoring this event. He is also associate professor at the London School of Economics, and Centax, the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation. They're focused on improving public understanding of tax policy and helping to design a better tax system. So very well placed for this panel. And then finally, Heather, who is really in the midst of the reporting that's of course been ongoing with regards to the budget. She's the economics editor at The Guardian. She was formerly The Guardian's political editor, the economics editor of The Observer, and the business editor of The Observer. So a very esteemed panel. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it to Dan to kick us off. Dan, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As Carson said, congratulations to you all for being here on the final morning of conference. Well, not the final morning, but the final morning of a full day of conference. Will you make it to a 9 a.m. panel on Wednesday morning? Let's see. First of all, just to say, I don't know why you invited me to do this panel, because I'm the tax minister and this is a discussion about tax. And so my objective is to be incredibly boring and have nothing interesting to say. And normally at these events, as a minister, you sort of look around to check whether there's a journalist in the room. I can see some, but there's actually one on the panel. So I'm going to have to be particularly careful, and you wouldn't expect anything less.
Just pretend I'm not here.
Treasury minister. Well, there's others in the audience. So even though I don't promise to be anything other than boring today, I will aim to be better than some of my predecessors. So when you get appointed to a government job, one of the first things you do is suddenly cancel the dentist appointment that you had for that morning, which I had to do so I could get in on time. And then you look up who's done the job before you, it turns out. And in my case, I have the illustrious predecessors, including Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch and Priti Patel. So I don't know what that means about this job. Does it mean that the bar is incredibly low and that I can surmount it? Yes. Does it mean that my political career is going to end in failure, as I hope theirs does? Hopefully not. But maybe this event will put me in their column. Who knows? Look, what I can do is sort of run through, and Carson sort of stolen my thunder in some ways, but sort of run through the big picture sort of argument and approach to tax and public spending of this government. We saw it play out at the last budget, and the past is often a good guide to the future. So, look, when faced with sort of difficult economic constraints, the Chancellor you sort of have a range of options, right? You can do David Cameron-style austerity and massively cut public spending. That's like one way out. They really reduced day-to-day spending in the 2010s and continued to do it after Cameron left until Boris Johnson realised that things needed to go up rather than down when it came to public services. You could do that. You could slash public sector investment, as the Conservatives did in 2010 when they came in. That's option one, austerity. Option two is the sort of Liz Truss, Nigel Farage option, which is to borrow more. And we saw what happened in 2022 with Liz Truss and all the decisions that she made. And we can see that basically Nigel Farage said he liked that budget and that the plans that they set out at the last election would have done that and then some more. And we can see the economic risk that additional borrowing would bring. So that's option two. Or option three is to get a grip on the situation, to raise taxes, to fund public services, to avoid additional borrowing, to improve things for this country through better funded public services, and to make sure that we don't end up in a position where, under the Conservatives, year after year, obviously they talked about bringing the deficit down, but what have we ended up with? We've ended up being in a place where the debt is so high that 1 in 10 pounds that the government spends is going on debt interest payments, as the Chancellor reminded us yesterday. And so our choice is not to borrow more, is not to do austerity, and was at the budget last year to make, big decisions on taxation. And every time, and Johan has this too in the Commons, when we're standing there at the Treasury questions or what have you, every time there's a political debate in the House of Commons about taxation, the Tories are and Reform, but there's only 5 of them in the corner and they never turn up. But the Tories are in a structurally bad and weak place on this because they stand up and say, oh, you shouldn't put tax up, yada, yada. And our response is really clear, and the right response, which is you want all of the benefits, Conservative Party, Reform Party, and Liberal Democrats too, sorry to say, of the increased taxation that the Chancellor did at the last budget, but you're not willing to say how you want to pay for it. They're willing that ends. Yes, we want the additional spending for the NHS for all the things that people want to see happen in the NHS. Yes, they want to see public services, schools, local government. They're not coming out and saying which public services they want to cut, but they've got no plan and no idea other than some made-up back-of-the-envelope calculations that Tory ministers have said, basically made up on the back of the envelope when it comes to welfare cuts, as to how they fund anything. And so I think that structurally, I feel quite confident that we're in a sound position, and our opposition, because of the good decisions that the Chancellor made in the budget last year, ended up boxing themselves into quite a difficult place where it's just not credible, the place that they've got themselves to. And I imagine we'll see some version of the Conservatives staying in that corner where, that they won't support any of the changes in the budget, I imagine, whatever's going to be in the budget, because that's what they'll do. But they'll still want to, avoid saying, okay, well, we would take this out of the NHS. We would take that out of local government. We would, undo the changes that this government's made. And then just one more thing I'll say, which is just about me. So I was the government's growth mission champion in my first year as an MP. Each of the missions got a champion. And we didn't get a little plastic medal or a little trophy, which is really disappointing. I guess in the end I did get a government job out of being a champion for a year, so that's a good thing. But I sort of asked to do that role when the party emailed us at the start of July 2024. And I'm glad that Ellie Roos appointed me to it, because I'm sort of a bit obsessed with economic growth. And just fundamentally, and I know lots of you in this room know this, but forgive me for repeating it, like every year for decades in Britain, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, GDP per capita goes up, productivity goes up, and average living standards for typical families goes up. Some decades it's 20%, some decades it's 30%, but you can put the lines on a chart and they move in line with one another. In America and other countries they don't. There's been a big divergence. IPPR and others have done really interesting, good work showing like that decoupling. It's not really happened here. I know maybe this is a bit contested actually, IPPR, I think maybe there's more of a decoupling, but it's not really happened here. And until the 2010s, when the lines go from up here to right down to zero, where wages stagnate because productivity stagnates. And until we can get our growth up, we're not going to be in a place where we can sustainably fund public services and where we can improve the sort of living standards and the prosperity of family finances. So the route to better public finances and better family finances is higher growth. First half of the year, fastest growth in the G7. That was in our manifesto, and we've achieved it in those first 6 months, and I hope we continue to do so. But sort of that is, for me, that is the route out of lots of our problems. So when I'm faced with decisions and sort of giving advice to the Chancellor as she makes decisions for the budget, at the top of my mind is, what will this tax change do for our ability to grow our economy and make people better off? So that's sort of where I'm coming at when officials are coming to talk to me. That they know now that they need to think about that angle, because I'm going to ask them about it. That's enough from me in opening. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Maybe let's hand over to Yuan. How do you see sort of the spending pressures in the autumn? How are you thinking about this?
So I think Dan set out really nicely the different fiscal options, and I think I can focus in on one of them, which is talk a bit more about the tax side of things. And taxation is often grouped in the same category as death and other unhappy topics. And I'm glad that you've all come out so early in the morning to hear us talk about this topic. But I do think that we need to have a national conversation around what taxation is for, and what are the proceeds used for, and also what are the benefits of taxation, not just for the exchequer and for the amount of money the government can take in to spend on public services, but in terms of shaping the economy. We've had multiple different, sometimes radically different taxation systems in the history of the UK. In the 18th, 19th century, when we were more of a mercantilist country, depending on trade, we had huge import and export tariffs and raised most of our taxation from those. Then we moved towards an income tax regime, in which income tax is now one of the biggest sources of taxation. So the way in which a country decides to structure its tax regime is really important, not just for the amount it generates for the exchequer, but also for the incentives that it shapes in the economy. And now that we're not in the 18th or 19th century, we're in a century where, in a pluralistic democracy, fairness and justice is really, really important to all of our residents, and in particular, I think, on lots of polling, particularly to Labour voters. And so we want to structure a tax system, I would argue, that tilts towards fairness and tilts towards sound economic objectives, particularly those that promote the kind of growth that Dan mentions that we've had too little of in our adult lifetimes. So I mention that because I think too often the conversation around tax is done in a very kind of spiteful kind of price tag way. It's very much about how, where is the 5 billion or the 10 billion or whatever coming from, and which groups are losing and winning. And that is, of course, part of the debate. And as a former FT journalist, I also see that is something that journalists do and should write about. But I think the bigger question about tax is what is wrong with the current tax system? What kinds of behavior does it incentivize? And how can we reshape the tax system so that incentivizes fairer and more growth-promoting behavior? I know that most people in the audience today probably don't have teams of accountants that are in your entourage, although maybe I'm mistaken. I certainly never needed to have an accountant in my life until recently, when I wrote a book, which you should all buy, of course. But for most of my life, I think most people on the panel here probably, similarly most people in the audience, paid our tax through being on the payroll. So for 8 years, I was on the FT payroll. They did my PAYE tax. I basically didn't really think about my taxes, didn't really have to calculate anything, and also couldn't, if I had even wanted to, avoid those taxes because they were charged on the payroll. As soon as I wrote, as soon as I came to sign a book deal, a friend of mine who's another author said to me, well, Yuan, now that you're signing this deal, you should go speak to an accountant about what your options are. So I had the first time in my life I had a conversation with an accountant who specialized in media. And the first thing he asked me, and this was, I sold my book in 2021, I think it was, or two, 2021. The first thing he asked me was, have you considered non-dom status? And I said, no, and I'm not going to. And the next thing he said was, have you considered opening a company and structuring your income from your book as company dividends or as a sale of a book to avoid the additional income tax? So immediately, in the first 5 minutes of my dipping my toe into non-payroll earnings, I was already being offered this swathe of options which are perfectly legal. And many, many people take them. And I use that as an example to say that for me and my residents in Early and Woodley in Reading, most people on the doorstep, when they talk to me, will be talking about their income taxes, their council taxes, these different forms of taxation that they feel are being unfairly levied at a rate because they don't see the returns coming out in terms of what those taxes are now being paid for. There's a feeling of very little bang for your buck, and that's partly due to the crises that we've inherited, the crisis in special educational needs, in adult social care, in temporary accommodation, homelessness, all these things that our councils, particularly London councils like Dan's, spend millions of pounds on per year. So that's one set of views around taxation. But that is one set of taxes that most people, ordinary people, see in their daily lives. But there's a whole realm of taxation that's outside of what ordinary people see. And what's important about this other realm of taxation is that it's the taxation that is often very distortionary in terms of people avoiding it through, as I mentioned, opening companies that aren't really companies. They're more just their vehicles for trying to get a lower rate of income tax on what is actually earned income, and also routes for avoidance for those who are very, very high in asset wealth as well. So all of that is to say that in this category of taxes, when we come to things like capital gains tax reform, it's really important to consider, do these set of taxes actually increase the amount of productive capacity in the economy? Do they incentivize good behavior? Or are they kind of more like forms of game playing? And I would argue that the conversation I had with my accountant, it didn't, whatever options I took, it wouldn't have improved my ability to write my book, or to write a better book, or to write a more best-selling book. And for anyone taking those options, whether you're, for example, a bank consultant, a consultant working in a bank who decides to leave the bank and then restructure your business as your own individual company and so on, those things I don't think are really adding any productive capacity to the economy. They are a form of game playing. And that leads to a kind of zero-sumness where a lot of very productive activity is being channeled outside of the most productive vehicles. So I think there's a whole amount of opportunity for the government to improve the tax regime in a way that not only raises revenue to fund the public services we really sorely need, but also decreases the amount of game playing in the economy and improves the economic efficiency. And you can also use some of those proceeds to reinvest in promoting truly productive capacity, in entrepreneurship, and so on. So I'll say that as my opening, and I'm happy to go into more specific proposals for that as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And I think that's a perfect segue to hand over to Andy, because you've, of course, done a lot of work on like what are tax policies that could make the system fairer, but would address some of these murky aspects of the tax system, but also be pro-growth. So it'd be great to hear.
Yeah, great. So I think Dan's actually set up very nicely that there's these two challenges really that the government faces. On the one hand, the need to raise additional tax revenues to fund public spending and to do that instead of increasing borrowing, but at the same time, as Johan has expanded, also to get growth. And I think some people have sort of presented that as a hopeless challenge or something that we can't reconcile. But I want to start with, I think, some good news, which is that actually, fortunately, our current tax system is so badly designed that there are lots of opportunities to both raise revenue and increase economic efficiency. So we're not at the frontier at the moment where you have this acute trade-off between raising more tax and compromising growth. Actually, there is scope to do both, and largely that's because there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit in our current tax system. But what's really important then is that we do that by reform of the tax system, not just by tweaking rates. I think the history of budgets over the past 20, 30 years really has been a tendency to reach for the levers of just put rates up or put rates down and thinking that that's all there is to tax policy. And that's why we're in this mess, but I mean mess in a positive sense, opportunity for growth enhancing revenue raising measures. But we need to do that through structural reform of the tax system, by which I mean changes to what we tax, how we tax it, rather than just the rates that we apply. And I think maybe controversially, again, amongst some economic commentators, I actually think that the government's manifesto pledges on the main rates of tax is actually a good thing in that respect, because it is going to force, frankly, that hard thinking about structural reform of the tax system, where there is a worry that were those levers, those kind of easy changes in the sense of administratively, it's just one stroke of the pen to increase the basic rate of income tax or to increase national insurance contributions. Those are easy things to do administratively, but they're not solving the hard problems that would enable us to unlock growth and raise tax revenue. Those are the options that do involve that trade-off between raising revenue and growth. So I think it's a good thing that the government is in a position, maybe wasn't the reasons for entering into those manifesto commitments at the time, but now that they're here, I think they're actually an important assurance that we will get some structural reform to the tax system. The other thing, just as a sort of big picture point to touch on, is sort of how much of this we can do through taxes on top earners and the wealthy. So there is a view that kind of all of our public spending problems could be solved if we just taxed the rich more. There's another view out there that there's really no money in taxing the rich. They'll just leave, they'll just find clever ways around it. And so, you know, it's been said, for example, by the CBI recently that, you know, we do need to fall back on breaking those manifesto pledges and just increasing income tax because there's no money to be found elsewhere. I think I disagree with both of those positions. Actually, there is quite a large amount of revenue, certainly the sorts of sums that the government might be looking for in this budget, from reforms to the way that we tax different forms of income across different forms of work. So partnerships, for example, as well as not just raising tax again on employees. Also the way that we tax investment income, and the fact that that currently doesn't face the same national insurance contributions, which is effectively an income tax on sources of income from investment, and the way that we tax capital gains. All of those are options that could raise significant sums that would come disproportionately, overwhelmingly from the top of the income and wealth distribution. But if you want to sort of address those immediate fiscal constraints and have a big picture for public spending over the long term, I think it is fair to say that there will, in the longer run, need to be some broader-based tax rises as well. But I would still see those reforms on taxes at the top as being a political prerequisite. If we're asking the rest of the population to make difficult choices, whether that's on public spending or other tax rises, it doesn't seem feasible to do that in an environment where we can still point to the really low effective tax rates that are paid by some people at the very top. So I would see the taxes at the top. It's not the silver bullet, the solution to all our problems, and there are no tough choices left, but it probably is a prerequisite for getting public acceptance for other reforms to the tax system.
Great.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And finally, Heather, how do you see this debate evolving?
So I think it's worth pointing out a very difficult communications challenge the Chancellor is going to have in the budget, right? Because last year is a sort of classic Labour tax and spend budget. Going to have to raise some taxes. Sorry, everyone, but look at all these lovely things you get. This year, looks like she's going to have to raise taxes possibly quite significantly as a result of a forecast downgrade from the Office for Budget Responsibility, because, you know, they're accepting that productivity probably isn't going to bounce back. That's quite hard to explain. I know it's hard to explain because I often have to explain it in news articles, and it's quite, you know, so this year she's going to have to say, I'm sorry, you know, taxes are going to have to go up, not because I can offer you very much more in return, but because the economy is sort of, the underlying economy is weaker than we previously thought. I think that's formidably difficult, and you need some very strong arguments to do that. I think there's great arguments for a lot of these things, you know, the changes about rental income, about dividend income, about CGT, about all those things. I think there's definitely a pro-growth, pro-productivity argument for them. I think there's also quite a strong fairness argument, and I think that is a bit that we maybe don't quite so often hear. I think Rachel Reeves did it a little bit when she talked about the farming inheritance tax, which is one of the ways she raised tax last year. But I think this is a government that's quite reluctant to identify groups that it wants to sort of hit. I think it doesn't like picking a fight particularly, and you know, I think I don't think you're going to be able to raise that much tax and go out there and say I'm doing this, you know, because I think it's better for growth and more efficient. I think you're also going to have to say sorry McKinsey partners, sorry, you know, whoever it might be, sorry buy-to-let landlords. I think you're unfairly lightly taxed, and you know, you're going to have to shoulder a bit more of the burden because your shoulders are some of the broad, and I think that is an argument that this particular Labour government slightly struggles to make, and I think it's going to be very, very needed because I think it's going to be quite a challenging. I mean, we don't know how big the number is, right? That she's going to have to find, that Dan is going to have to find, but we think it's going to be quite large, and the larger the number, the harder it becomes to do it with tweaks, very important and needed tweaks, but tweaks. I think I would also just let the question hang in the air a bit about the manifesto promises, and not only that, but even go back further than that and ask the question of whether Labour should have supported those national insurance cuts that Jeremy Hunt did, because, so if you talk to Labour politicians, they will say to you, we couldn't have won the general election without those manifesto promises. But my goodness, they've really made themselves a very difficult, made themselves a very hard challenge. And it's difficult, right? But I think if you talk to sort of elections experts, they will tell you that the public aren't necessarily scrutinising every line of the manifesto. They're getting a kind of general vibe for whether you've put taxes up or not, whether the economy, whether they're better off, whether you're. So I would just slightly question the idea that every detailed manifesto, if you broke one of those detailed manifesto promises, that would be something of a completely different order to whacking up tax on buy-to-let landlords. I know that I think it's how politicians think. I'm not totally sure it's how the the public thinks. So I would just sort of raise that question, especially because Andy said even if you do all of those much needed and important reforms which would improve fairness, maybe down the line we're all going to have to chip in a bit more. And there are arguments, you know, we'd sort of had it trailed. There was the suggestion that Rachel Reeves's speech was going to have contribution as a big theme yesterday and that everybody has to sort of contribute. But I think she only said it once, so I'm not sure. It must have been, maybe it was a theme that was sort of toyed with and then, but you know, there are arguments for, sorry guys, you know, we're all going to have to chip in, we're all going to have to pay a bit more, and you know, there are sort of solidarity arguments, there are sort of ways of talking about it. And I suppose the only other point I would raise, which is a sort of a process one, but it has a big impact, is the way that, it seems to be the way the Treasury thinks about this in the run-up to a budget, is all to do with how the OBR operates and how that process operates and what you can and can't put in your spreadsheet. And I've had conversations with sort of Treasury types, and you'll say, what about, you know, wealth tax or, you know, whatever it might be. There's lots of reasons, you know, lots of practical issues with the wealth tax. But they will say, the OBR won't score it, shrug. And which is, you know, that's a measure of what the certainty is about how much a tax might raise and so on. But we've sort of got ourselves into a situation where we're not making decisions in a particularly sensible way, I would argue. Certainly looking back at the spring statement last year and having to find £5 billion or £6 billion of welfare changes. And if the OBR were meant to prevent the Treasury fiddling the figures, which is, you know, it's good to have an independent forecaster. But somehow we're talking about tax reform, not from the point of view of, does this make the economy work better, but, you know, what numbers will the OBR put in its spreadsheets, which is a little bit reductive. And just the last thing I would say is that I mean, your suggestion was it was good to have the manifesto promises because thank goodness it would make Labour think about tax reform, which I completely get. But I do think there are some madnesses in the tax system that it would be just good to, you know, things like fuel duty is going to fall off a cliff and nobody's ever talked about how it's going to be. It's big, and I can't remember the number, but it's very big. It's going to need to be replaced and no one ever talks about it. And the other one is, which we know is very politically difficult, but council tax is completely mad. And, you know, every economist will tell you it's completely mad and no one, you know, seems to be able or willing to grip it. And I know the politics are very difficult, but you can build arguments for things over time if you know, start setting them out.
Yeah.
Bit scattergun points a bit there.
Thanks, and a lot of points to pick up on. Actually, there was one that I really was keen to bring out, which was, say, if there was a international portfolio investor on this panel, they might sort of respond to your 2 points, Andy and Yuan. It might say, well, if you put national insurance on investment income, of course there will be less investment. Of course, there'll be less returns. So there'll be less portfolio investment, or somebody who invests in houses, you know, if there's more national insurance on rental income, they'll be saying, of course there'll be less investment. So of course this is anti-growth. What would you respond to that investor? Do you want to go first and then Yuan?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's an irony in that argument about international investment that we can kind of draw out from the last budget. I was thinking about this around about this time last year when the government was simultaneously floating an increase in employer national insurance contributions, which happened, and also an increase in capital gains tax rates. And I remember it was the time we were coming up to the International Investment Summit. And all of the analysis was about how can the government be trying to sell foreign investment at a time when they're increasing capital gains tax, which unfortunately just completely misunderstands how capital gains tax works. It's paid by UK residents, it's not paid by international investors. But actually increasing employer national insurance contributions is something that affects international investors in UK businesses because that's adding to the business cost in the business that they're investing in. So I think sometimes there are kind of simple takes that you can have about the effect of tax reforms on international investment that in that case, for example, got things precisely the wrong way round. The threat to international investment was from the increase in tax on employees through employer national insurance contributions. Actually, a structural reform to capital gains tax could have removed some of the disincentives to growth and actually been good for investment by small business owners in the UK, which is really what capital gains tax is about. It's not about international investment in the UK. They're not affected by the UK treatment of capital gains. Capital gains tax is really all about what investment small business owners in the UK do.
And I think to that I would say, what do we mean by investment? Because a lot of things that are counted as investment under the current capital gains regime aren't, I would say, productive investment. And you gave the example of landlords and NICs, income that you pay, so rent that I'm sure many people in the audience pay to their landlord. Is that an investment that the landlord has made? Of course, landlords, the good landlords, invest a bit in upkeeping the property. They perform some kind of services. But in the middle of central London, £1,500 a month, is that invested in your property? Is the property itself improving in any productive sense? Or could you, the rentee, have basically done the same thing if only you'd had the same amount of savings as your landlord? Similarly, with capital gains, in my book example, if I had decided to open a company and structure my income through that company, I wouldn't have invested anything. I would just be taking my income that I'd earned from selling my book through a different channel and getting a lower tax rate on it. So I think there are lots of examples that under the current tax system, because of its many loopholes and flaws and because it's the longest in the world and because of all these historical kind of things that have piled on top of our very messy tax system, are counted and treated as investment, but aren't really productive investment. And at the same time, there are also things that I would argue are productive investment, the kind of risks that entrepreneurs take and the losses that they make, that we could reward better if we were to divert some of the tax rebates that we give to people making non-productive investments back to people making actually productive investments.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. And it's quite interesting that it's not really just a progressive argument for tax reform. Like the Institute for Fiscal Studies in their Merle's review, it's like their big tax review, they're like, we're actually really bad. Our tax system is quite bad at incentivizing productive investment. And what it's good at is like, if you make lots of returns, then there is low tax rates on this often. But it's not very good at incentivizing investment. And I think that's also like a really powerful case for reform, is that really pro-growth tax reform could be making it cheaper for you to invest, lowering your tax bill if you invest, but taxing rents more, those high returns or those that are really just avoiding a certain type of tax. Cool. Another point I wanted to pick up on. Oh, by the way, did you want to come in on this point, Dan or Heather? Great. So there's obviously, and we'll soon go to audience question, but I wanted to bring this up. Obviously, there have been lots of calls for a wealth tax in the UK, and that is reflecting people seeing that there's increased inequality, that people feel like maybe those at the top don't yet pay their fair share. I just wanted to invite reflections on, is that impression right, that we have the balance not quite fair in terms of those who pay more and those who pay less? And if anyone wants to comment on the proposal of a wealth tax in particular, is that the right call for this moment, or are there other options? So just curious. Yeah, Dan. Good.
So I think we sort of should be realistic that we do have wealth taxes in this country, even if we don't have a capital W, capital T wealth tax. And that other countries that do have capital W, capital T wealth taxes often don't have some of the taxes that we do have. So the big ones are inheritance tax, where last year a Labour government made a decision to increase inheritance tax in various ways in order to raise revenue fairly. So we are up for having some of these discussions. And the other big tax is capital gains tax, which is in a sense also a tax on wealth, where again last year raised a really significant chunk of the money that we raised in the budget last year. We increased capital gains tax. And, yes, always looking at what reforms we can make to different parts of the tax system. But I think the calls for a wealth tax miss that we're already doing a fair chunk of taxing wealth. And also we tax wealth through council tax, which we do raise more from council tax, even though there's lots of problems with the system, and many other countries do as well. So we should have that context, I think, when we're having this debate.
Yeah.
I think the motivation underlying calls for a wealth tax is this general idea that income from wealth is currently taxed much lower than income from work. And that is undoubtedly true. And that is the problem that I think we should be sort of focused on solving, initially through reforms to our existing taxes. So there I agree with Dan that we have taxes on wealth, but at the moment, actually, if you're working, as Johan said earlier, on payroll, you're paying much higher effective tax rates than if you receive your income from wealth in the form of, for example, rental income or capital gains. So I think that's the place to start on the work that I did with Aaron Advani and Emma Chamberlain on the Wealth Tax Commission in 2020. That's essentially what we concluded on an annual wealth tax. I think we can have discussions about sort of, again, at the frontier, if we've done these other reforms, what the case for a wealth tax is. The reality anyway is that in the upcoming budget, I think there is no prospect of a wealth tax because there is not anywhere near the institutional capability to deliver that. For example, a few months ago, HMRC admitted in Parliament that they couldn't actually tell Parliament how many billionaires were tax resident in the UK under our current system. So a tax authority that can't measure wealth in the existing population is not ready to administer a wealth tax in 2 months from now. So I think we can be pretty confident that that won't be in the budget, but that is also an example where, whether or not we want a wealth tax, we do need to have information about the wealth of people who are in the UK, because that, even if we're not taxing wealth directly, it matters for their compliance with the existing taxes that we do have. And so I think the focus should be on developing that institutional capacity to make sure that the wealthy are paying the tax that's due under the current tax system, first of all.
Great. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to open it up to the... Wow. Fantastic. So let's get 3 or 4 very quick questions so we get as many in as possible. Let's start over here in the front, and then to you next.
Hi, my name is Sarah Hall. I'm the Executive Director of Positive Money, and I have a quick question with regards to taxing banks. At Positive Money, we put forward a proposal based on a model in Spain, which would raise about 11.3 billion pounds. IPPR has also done an excellent paper on putting forward a slightly different model, but it almost doesn't. The question is not, which model, but, should there be something in the budget? There is fantastic policy work out there to tax the banks more. The TUC has done some excellent polling, which shows it's very popular.
Thank you. And then a person over here in the front.
Good morning, panel. So, like Dan, I'm absolutely obsessed with economic growth. Like Heather, I'm a former business editor of the Observer. I've got a different hat on today. I'm here on behalf of people with osteoporosis, 3.5 million of us in the UK. And one of the things that I think about economic growth is, if we're going to have economic growth, we really need to address the issue of economic inactivity. More than 9 million people economically inactive, many of them sick and living with disabilities. Now, I discovered I had osteoporosis in an accident in 2023. I was really lucky. The hospital that I went to had a fracture liaison service. These diagnose you quickly, get you treatment quickly, and it meant that I did not miss a single day's work, even though I'd broken my shoulder and 2 vertebrae in my spine. Now, there are lots of people whose lives and careers have been wrecked through osteoporosis. If we rolled out fracture liaison services across the whole country, they're only in 50% of the country at the moment, that is a quick and easy solution. Osteoporosis doesn't just affect the elderly, it's people of working age whose careers are being wrecked, when, like me, they could go back to work and pay loads of tax. Does the panel agree that the government should produce a plan to roll out fracture liaison services as soon as possible, as it's promised to do?
Great, thank you. Then the person all the way over there in the back with the face mask. Great.
Thank you very much. Dennis Fernando from Friends of the Earth, and just talking about fairness and about the broad shoulders that are needed to shoulder the burden. We are looking at the climate plan that is due to come back in late October, and making part of that there should be a tax on polluters and the fossil fuel companies who are making billions out of the revenue raising cost of living through bills. And so it feels like in terms of shouldering the burden, there needs to be a very strong impetus on them to pay. And I don't see that from the government at the moment in terms of people who can afford. And so what can we do to push that harder? And just to say, extreme weather, if you look at what's happened across Europe, it's costing GDP. So they really have to come to zero and then start contributing in order for us to have a transition.
Great, thank you. Let's take two more. So, person over here in the front with glasses.
Hi, Joe Wright with Tax Justice UK. Every decade or so, the government does a zero-based review of what it spends money on, but the tax code, they've never done this, and the way tax reliefs are costed is normally, and assessed is normally only because the Public Accounts Committee or whatever found some great scandal. So would you support a zero-based review of the entire tax code? So nearly all 1,200 exemptions.
Okay, and finally, the gentleman over here.
Reflecting on the huge shift in economic resources into my generation at the cost of the younger generation, should it not be, is there not an issue about the future of inheritance tax, for example, to find some ways of ensuring that we can recycle that wealth through the younger generation into more investment and economic growth, rather than just seeing it as a straight paying method to pay for public services. So it's about addressing the huge shift that we've seen, the growth, massive accumulation of capital wealth. We've all had, houses. At my age, we've had houses, we've had pensions, we've had decent income, we've had free public services, etc. The younger generation get none of this, and no wonder there is feelings of injustice in the community about this.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, we have a question on banks, polluters, indeed, the zero-based review of the tax system, and sort of intergenerational fairness and inheritance tax. So I'll start with Dan, who I think needs to shoot off a bit early.
Oh my gosh, yeah, wow, it's almost 10, yes. Lots of questions. On inheritance tax and the final question around fairness between the generations, look, we are trying to do all that we can on the spending side to help families who are struggling, sort of everyday working age families. So I do think, we have seen a lot of announcements this week and already since we've taken office. So we've got rollout of free breakfast clubs in every school across the country, extending free school meals to every child on universal credit. Yesterday we saw from Bridget Phillipson that we're going to bring back the maintenance grants for kids from backgrounds like mine who go to higher education. I don't know whether I would have gone to university if I didn't have a grant to help me with my living costs. And so I think that's a really important step as well. And also, we have actually properly funded childcare from 9 months and above for parents who want to put their kids into nurseries so that the kid can benefit and also so that they can get back to work. So there's a lot that we have done. And also on inheritance tax, one of the things that you can see if you look in OBR documents is that the amount that we're going to raise from that is going to go up and up and up and up because the threshold is not going up and yet property prices are going up. And so we are bringing in more revenue there. And we also changed it last year. Business property relief, agriculture property relief, changes in relation to pension treatment on inheritance tax. So I would sort of, last year in the budget, we raised £8 billion from sort of wealthy end. So be that VAT on private schools, tax changes to inheritance tax, changes to capital gains tax, changes to how we tax private jets. I think we shouldn't forget that we did make some of those big calls last year. Again, every single one of them being opposed by the Conservatives. On zero-based review of the entire tax code, well, I'm definitely wanting to look across the piece to see what we can do, to see where we can make changes that will help make the tax system fairer, make the tax system more efficient, And also, I would give credit to HMRC for, over recent years, doing a better job of understanding the volume and the sort of number of tax reliefs that we have in this country. Like, we now know more than we did know about how much we're not getting from various tax reliefs, which is a change, and I think we're doing better than that than others. And maybe I'll just touch on one more, and then the others come in.
You're going to tax the banks?
I'm going to touch on the environmental side of things here, where I think actually one of the things that we are planning to do from 2027, there's still more details to work out, and I think the EU's figuring out how to do this, is to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I don't know whether people have heard of this. CBAM is the exciting acronym, which I think is a really important way of making sure that as we decarbonise in the UK, we don't end up in a situation where essentially we're just offshoring our emissions to other countries. There's lots of decisions for the government, for me, in order to get that right, to make sure it works, to make sure that the price that people who are importing pay is fair and reflects the carbon price here in the UK. But I think that is a really important step that will help reflect the fact that what we want to do when it comes to getting to a net zero world, as it were, is make sure that we're not just doing really great job here at decarbonising, but then ending up actually just still having the same amount of fossil fuel related production happening without the incentives changing internationally. And the EU said it's going to bring a CBAM in from next year. We still need to see the details on how they'll do that. We've said we're going to come in from January 2027, and I think that is sort of a good and welcome change, which I'm sure all the policy wonks at IPPR are really happy about. Yeah, there we go.
Great. Let's go Andy, Heather, and then finish with you, Andy.
Yes, I'll just pick up this point about the intergenerational wealth transfer and inheritance tax, and maybe briefly on tax relief. So, I mean, I think we do need to think hard about a significant overhaul of our inheritance tax system, but I would worry slightly that maybe some of the wrong political lessons will be learnt from the last budget and attempts to reform inheritance tax, because obviously that has been an incredibly kind of controversial, bordering toxic debate since then. And some of the work that Sentax has done since then has looked again at those reforms. And I think in broad terms, the idea that if we're going to have an inheritance tax, it should apply equally across all forms of wealth, which is kind of the underlying motivation, I think, for those reforms to agricultural and business property relief, was in the right direction. But I think that there is scope for improving on that reform, and through engagement actually that we had with farm groups and business groups, the work that we did suggested there are opportunities actually to raise more revenue from inheritance tax, whilst also addressing those concerns that those groups have raised. So I think there's a way of doing tax policy that can, on these big issues, try to bring people with you, and I think that there is scope for that even in this very difficult area of inheritance tax. Just briefly on tax reliefs, forget zero-based review. At the moment, HMRC reports spending only £500,000 a year evaluating tax reliefs. Let me just say that again, £500,000. We normally talk about millions, billions, trillions sometimes in the context of tax revenue. That is not a sensible amount of money to be spending resourcing such an important issue. And if this were public spending, that wouldn't be the way that it was approached. So I think, that ideally we would start from scratch with all of the tax reliefs and rules in our system. But I think even prioritising the ones that are, that need the most looking at, where there's revenue at stake and a very weak evidence base currently, there is a case for sort of spending some money to save some money in the long run by trying to evaluate those reliefs properly. So agree with that.
Great. Heather.
I mean, I would just say, I'm not making any decisions, obviously, but I would say yes to bank tax, even if only on a windfall basis. I know you've got your own policy, Carsten, on this, or you've done your own work on this, but I don't think the government will do it. But I think that is, I think that would definitely be one to look at, because part of those profits have been generated by high interest rates. right? And by the impact of quantitative easing, which let's not go into here, not to inflict too much pain on the audience, but I think that's and just to pick up the generational point, I think one response to that would be to look at the triple lock, which I know is very difficult politically. And I went to the launch of the Pensions Commission recently, which Torsten Bell, formerly of your shop, was launching, who I've heard many times talk about the unaffordability of the triple lock. And of course, now as a minister is saying, I've set up this whole new Pensions Commission. It's going to look very broadly, independently at pensions, but it's not going to touch the triple lock. And it costs a lot more than it was intended to, and it creates sort of volatility. And I think that's one of those ways of looking at the sort of intergenerational issue, and a bit more progressive taxation of properties, because as you say, property is a big aspect of that sort of generational transfer. Have we left any unanswered? Fracture clinics, Ruth's fracture clinics.
Maybe, yes, I think the polluters and
and
environmental
polluters.
tax, I guess you touched
You
on
did a bit of
CBAM.
polluters, CBAM, yeah.
I can have a quick go at fracture clinics, actually, in a slightly different
I think
way.
we need to draw it to a
Yeah,
close.
can I-
So
yeah, I'm happy to
great.
talk
So
about.
you have the last word.
I'll talk a bit about banks' inactivity and tax relief. So,
Fantastic.
firstly, on tax relief, the previous Treasury Committee, of which I'm a member, had a big report on the cost of non-structural tax reliefs and the fact that the politics of tax reliefs means that they're not really looked at. So, when it comes to encouraging unproductive behaviour, one of Dan's illustrious predecessors in the Conservative Treasury department basically said to me, we know that if you wanted to reward a certain group of people, you could put a tax relief in there and it wouldn't get looked at for decades. Now that's not a very fair or efficient way of running an economy. It incentivizes people to spend lots and lots of money lobbying and spending time with people like Dan, which, although lovely, is not necessarily the one thing that people should be doing to try and get a tax break. And there are over £200 billion of non-structural tax reliefs from everything that things that you might have heard of, from business asset disposal relief to things like classic car relief, to all sorts of weird and wacky and wonderful reliefs that nobody's really looked at because, as that former predecessor mentioned, nobody questions them. So I would really support that. I think when all departments are doing zero-based reviews and looking at how to cut their cloth, I think the Treasury and HMRC need to be doing the same of what Dan has mentioned is already starting to happen at HMRC as well. And in terms of the scale of that, to move on to the inactivity question, £200 billion is the entire NHS budget for 1 year, and that's the amount that's paid out every single year in non-structural tax reliefs. I don't think we could get rid of the whole lot, but I think we should certainly look at them and justify them in the same way that the NHS has to just justify every single pound of its own spending. On inactivity, this is a particular interest of mine, and one that I had started asking questions about of the Treasury and other agencies on the Treasury Committee, particularly last year in the first ever budget of our Labour government, when we decided to make that huge capital investment in the NHS to build new hospitals, new diagnostic facilities, and so on. And I wanted to know about the economic impact of this. Now, the interesting thing is that and unfortunately, this is probably unhappy news to you and your colleagues in the front row, is that the kind of orthodox view of that is, firstly, it's not very clear what kind of impact that might have, NHS spending, what kind of impact that might have on inactivity. It's an area where there just simply isn't enough evidence. And in areas where there isn't enough evidence, the LBR or the Treasury will tend towards saying there's no impact. Now, that's obviously quite a conservative set of assumptions, but it also speaks to the power. Well, exactly, and it also speaks to the power of people, campaigners like you and all the economists and policy analysts in the room to actually make the argument that we have a crisis of health and inactivity in our country 5 years out from the pandemic. Many people, particularly disabled people, have never fully gotten their livelihoods back since the pandemic, and that is an issue. But it's not an issue that, sad to say, the OBR and the Treasury. It's a challenge. We need. I think everyone in the audience who is involved in this. Yes, exactly. So I think that's a big challenge, I think, for our society. And finally, on banks and on what's happening in the banking sector right now, I'll have a very brief stab at summarising the QE period. Essentially, during the financial crisis, which is when I came of age politically and started my studies in economics as an undergraduate. Just after that, George Osborne, the then Chancellor, and the Bank of England decided that they would embark on this huge program to try to inject a bit more liquidity into financial markets. They decided to do it in a way that they would essentially guarantee the commercial banks that there would be no losses, and the Bank of England that there would be no losses. That's probably the easiest way of summarizing that. And so because they made that guarantee, that promise, years and years ago, almost 12 years ago, I think they signed that agreement, it now leads to a situation where 12 years later, we're paying in the realm of 20 to 40 billion, depending on the interest rate in the year, of taxpayers' money through the Treasury to the Bank of England that's then given back to commercial banks. Now, the situation we're in is probably not a situation that any of those people involved, no matter how much we love to hate George Osborne, and I dearly do, might have envisioned back in 2012 when they first made that, signed that agreement. However, it is one that our generation is now paying the cost of. And I'd argue that there's a whole argument in there about fairness, about intergenerational fairness, about the decisions that have been made, I think badly made by previous Conservative chancellors and previous Conservative governments, but also about the democratic scrutiny of these decisions. If there's one takeaway I'd like to ask from the audience, it's that topics like these are not discussed nearly enough at 9 a.m. panels, and also are not widely known about. I think very few people probably know that there has been that transfer during the QE period that's affected everyone in my generation and in Dan's generation who's tried to buy a house, etc. I think that if the public had a greater awareness of economic trade-offs that have been made, more literacy on tax policy and where our taxes actually go and where taxes come from, we would have a very different debate. So it's one thing I would ask of the audience is to speak to your closest friends who have no interest in the discussion we're having today and get them interested.
Fantastic, thanks. I was actually a bit too prudent with the time. We have 7 minutes left. So we can get perhaps 2 more questions in. Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. But yeah, we can have maybe 2, 3 more questions. The gentleman over there on the right.
It's a shame that Dan's run off already, but never mind. It feels like confession. Tom Bradshaw, President of the National Farmers Union. So you talked about fair changes to taxation, but catching the elderly generation in an eye of a storm that they have no ability to plan their way out of, I don't think is fair in any way. But I think my main point is I don't think there's been enough conversation about how we drive economic growth, because the growth has to be the solution to how we resolve the tax income in the long run. And taxing business assets as though they're personal wealth is putting a massive block on investment going into those small family businesses at a time where we desperately need to unlock the growth opportunity. So I think we need to look at how we really drive economic growth through the economy. And I do believe the changes to APR and BPR are having a really negative impact on that.
Thank you. And then the person over there on the right. Just in the middle, by the corridor on the right. Yeah.
I think that the suggestion that the tax reform system is so bad it's ripe for reform and there's lots of low-hanging fruit is absolutely right. It's a shame we've lost Dan because the question is obviously what actually are they going to do? There is a lot of low-hanging fruit. Which one are they going to pick? To make this very personalised for me, I've had the good fortune to be able to take early retirement after a decade as a tax lawyer. And it can't be right that I now pay a lower rate of tax than people on the same level of income. There's obvious source of extra tax revenue that could be raised. It doesn't have to be punitive. It's just saying, why don't you pay the same rate of tax that people who earn a living do? And people like me are not going to run off to the Cayman Islands. So there are, as Andy says, a lot of opportunities, and the question is which one specifically should be taken as a priority.
Thank you. And then finally the person on the back. Will.
Hi, Will Snell from the Fairness Foundation. Is the Merleys review the right blueprint for broad-based reform of the tax system 15 years on, or do we need a new blueprint?
Great. Fantastic questions. Let's start with Heather.
Well, I don't think the IFS would thank you for reopening the Merleys review. I think they would say the principles are broadly right. I think they would say to sort of take it down off the shelf, not in all its details, but that it's Yeah, effectively right. What else did we have? Low-hanging fruit. I mean, I think in terms of low-hanging fruit, I think it depends, in all honesty, it depends how large a sum the Chancellor is going to have to be looking for, which we don't yet know. But I think it'll end up being a sort of a collection of things that add up to the whatever big number that she has. But I think the issue about earned and unearned income, which has come up over and over again, is the right one, I think.
Right, Andy?
Great. Yeah, I'll take the Merleys question first and then the inheritance tax one. So broadly, yes, I think that is the right blueprint and we shouldn't be sort of trying to reinvent the wheel. Actually, a lot of the tax reforms that we've recommended, the changes to capital gains tax, the changes to the way we treat different forms of income kind of have their roots in the Merleys review. I think if I were being critical, there's a few areas where the Merleys review doesn't really take account of the international dimensions of tax, which I think is very important for how you tax top earners and the wealthy. So there's a bit of a gap there. It also doesn't really have that much to say in the end about inheritance tax because, as the report kind of acknowledges, that starts with a philosophical question in a way more than an economic question. So it doesn't solve all our problems, but I think that is basically a sensible direction for the government to commit to following, and that would be growth enhancing. On inheritance tax specifically, so taking Tom's point, I mean, I think the concern that has been raised by farm and business groups with I think some justification is how the planned reform falls on active business owners and active farmers in a way that could have been refined, and in our report we suggest ways of doing this in a way that would reduce the liquidity constraint. That's the technical term for would people have to sell the farm or sell the business to pay the tax, which can have economically damaging effects, but whilst focusing the tax rise on those who are just passively investing in agricultural and business assets, and that is a way forward, I think, to square that circle, as I say, in what's been a very hectic debate between the need that the government says to raise revenue. Actually, you think you could raise a bit more revenue than the government did last time and address those concerns in a way that would be better for growth overall.
Great. And finally?
I wanted to go to the question that the retired tax lawyer that mentioned reminded me a lot of a conversation I had one of the first times I went door knocking in Sonning, which is part of my constituency. My constituency is a new one, so it knits together parts of four different former constituencies. And some of you might know that Sonning used to be represented by Theresa May, who actually also lives in my constituency now. So the first time I went door knocking in Sonning, which I had known to be, of course, a Conservative stronghold and one of the most affluent villages in the UK, I knocked on a door of a very lovely grand house, and a retired man opened the door, and he said to me, "I have one question for you. When will the Labour Party equalise capital gains and income tax?" So that people like me, he's a retired IT consultant, so that people like me don't game the system. And I thought that it was not, Sonning actually had a really great Labour turnout in the end in the general election, but it was not what I was expecting when going to that neighbourhood in particular. But on reflection, it's very interesting because that area is, I think, really representative of the kind of more affluent One Nation Tories that have effectively been abandoned by the Conservative Party. Many of them would be liberal on social values, certainly care a lot about fairness and justice, and on economic values are very much floating around a spectrum. And that kind of voter is not really catered for by any of the, traditionally by their old party, by the Conservative Party. I think there's a really important space in the national discourse around tax for retired people, for people who currently stand to benefit from many of the tax inefficiencies and imperfections that we have, to be actually talking about them in terms of the framing of fairness and justice as you have. So again, another ask from me is for those of you in that category to start using your voice as well.
Fantastic. I hope that after this fantastic panel, you also will ask a door-knocking Labour Party candidate whether they will reform the tax system and make it fairer and more pro-growth next time they knock on your door. Thanks so much for coming. It's really great. So those who wait, but not for those who wait too late.
'cause we gotta go